A gcuine úsla agus a cóide, tá anachas orm fáilte curróh go léir go hachad a bhríoga na hÉireann. Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to welcome you all to the Royal Irish Academy for tonight's discourse entitled The Nobel Prize and the Idea of the Universal. I'm Professor Pat Gyrey, President of the Royal Irish Academy. Also present here this afternoon is the Academy Treasurer, Professor Mary Kelly, and the Academy's Executive Director, Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan. Academy Discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented in 1786. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses, and they are available on the Academy website. Before we begin, we have some short Academy business to undertake. The minutes of our last discourse, There's So Much to Know, Post-Pandemic Reflections on the Human Thirst for Knowledge and Its Value and Utility, which was held on 10th of May 2023, were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I will take these as approved and I will sign the minute book after the discourse concludes. We'll welcome our distinguished and esteemed speakers for this evening's discourse. Anders Olsson is a literary historian and author. His own works include 7 collections of poetry, and he earned his doctorate with a dissertation about the works of Swedish poet Gunnar Ekelöf. Anders is Professor Emeritus in Literature at Stockholm University, and his research has examined fundamental elements in the development of modern literature. He has written some 15 books on poetry and the history of literature, and is also active as a critic. In 2008, he was elected to the Swedish Academy, which, as I found out this evening, has an exactly the same date when it was founded in 1786. So good things happened in Ireland and Sweden in the same year. He also served as its permanent secretary during 2018 and 2019. Anna Fuchs, MRIA, is Professor of German and Director of the Humanities Institute at University College Dublin. She was elected as member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2009. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Professor Olsson to the podium to deliver his lecture. Over to you.
Thank you so much for these welcoming words. I'm honored to be here at the Royal Irish Academy and speak to you tonight. I've chosen as my topic a problem that concerns our whole activity in the Nobel Committee in Stockholm. A problem that we have not faced enough, I think. Nobel Prize in Literature and the Idea of the Universal. And in this lecture, I would like to present and discuss the universal claims of the Nobel Prize in Literature. And one of my reasons for doing so is that universality lately has been questioned as a goal in the humanities. The controversies around race, gender, and other markers of identity abound in the public debate, placing under scrutiny the very idea of generalized claims of validity in the humanities. Here, I'll try to clarify in what senses the Nobel Prize in Literature has been understood historically as a universal prize, before turning to a discussion of how this idea can be maintained today. The Nobel Prize is and has in effect always been considered a universal prize. This is the unique, prestigious and everywhere acknowledged property. In her book, The World Republic of Letters, Pascale Casanova even writes, quote, "There is no better measure of the unification of the international literary field than the effectively universal respect commanded by this prize," end quote. How effective the prize is at unifying the literary world is open to debate, and I will not try to provide any answer here. That the Nobel Prize is universal is expressly formulated by the donor Alfred Nobel in his will of November the 27th in 1895. There he states his wish that the prize be distributed in 5 categories to those who, quote, have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. As for the literary prize, he declares that it should be awarded to, quote, the person who shall have produced in the field of literature the most outstanding work in an ideal direction, end quote. Importantly, Nobel does not admit any regional or national restrictions of the prize. It is global in the sense that works of all mankind should be considered. The second passage speaks, however, of a more specific value of a work produced in an ideal direction, words that the Academy had great difficulties making sense of in the first decades. If the literary Nobel Prize consistently has been regarded as universal throughout the previous century, it has been so in very different senses. To understand this, I think it is helpful to distinguish between 4 senses of the word universal in the history of the prize. First, universal range in terms of geographical extension. Second, universal range in terms of representation of race, gender, and culture. 3, universal accessibility and circulation. And 4, in the 4th sense, universal recognition and acclaim, which can be established, no doubt, even when accessibility is lacking. We should be aware that these uses of the term may conflict with the ultimate criterion of the prize, the excellence of literature, literary merit. Before I go into the history of the prize, let me also stress that these different and often conflicting views of the universal are construed by me retrospectively and not part of any explicit program of the Nobel Committee. The Nobel Committee has never had any such fixed, written down criteria. When looking backwards, one can also, and this is very important, observe a shifting relation between aesthetic and moral judgment, where literary merit has grown increasingly significant. After a market-oriented view of universal reach in the 1930s, the Swedish Academy changed its focus to innovative achievements, to what has been called the pioneers or the great precursors. This went hand in hand with a pragmatic doctrine adopted by the Academy at the end of the 1960s. One can regard this doctrine as an attempt to promote excellence in works of literature not duly recognized by the public and not necessarily in international circulation. There are, however, other areas where universality has been poorly achieved in the first 70 years of the prize, both in the first sense of geographical scope and in the second sense of representativity in terms of race, gender, or cultural background. The white, male, and Eurocentric domination was overwhelming in the first 7 decades. Still, after a slow start, the struggle for universal reach in its different dimensions has characterized the prize policy up until now, and in all probability will continue to do so. Articulating this ambition, I will at the same time set forth the dilemma: how can the autonomy of literary value be maintained under the ever-growing pressure of non-literary interests. Let me go back to the first decades of the prize and mention the problematic interpretations of the donor's words around universality. The first attempt of the committee proved particularly malfunctional, since its interpretation stretched the meaning of ideal direction beyond the literary meaning of universal, understanding ideal as idealistic. As Kjell has shown in his history of the prize, this corresponded to the philosophical aesthetic that descended from Goethe, Friedrich Schiller, and F.D. Fischer, and together with the conservative high morality of the times, it strongly determined the awards of the Nobel Committee in the first years. Together with a marked Eurocentric bias of the Academy, this severely limited the universal ambition. The prize was not considered a purely literary prize, which led to a clash between aesthetic and moral judgment. The result was that universally renowned writers like Leo Tolstoy or Henrik Ibsen, or for that matter August Strindberg in Sweden, could not satisfy the lofty and sound idealism being demanded. In the 1920s, however, a new paradigm appears where ideal is given a broader interpretation, as it was called profound human sympathy and nobility of style, referring to Longin's treatise Perihypsos, as the key words of the committee that appeal to the tradition of European humanism and the sublime poetics in a classical sense. Goethe's universal classicism, which also strongly inspired the first conservative committee, is now equally important, but given a more generous literary accent. Awards to Anatole France, and not least to William Butler Yeats in 1923, show a less doctrinary Academy in action. One should, however, note that Goethean classicism makes the committee unable to embrace a modernist epic like Thomas Mann's Der Zauberberg. Not even the Goethean paradigm of Weltliteratur has room at this point for one of the most innovative of European writers, moreover in the tradition of Goethe himself. The policy of the Academy seems, during these years, to stand in conflict with some of the most remarkable achievements of the 1920s, which often questioned artistic harmony and lofty ideals. The two first senses of universal that I mentioned, extension and representation, are poorly satisfied, and non-literary values dominate over purely literary aspects. The third problematic interpretation of the will of the donor, visible around 1930, represents an abandonment of the idealistic tendencies of the earlier period. Interestingly, after 3 rather shaky decades for the prize, the Academy explicitly speaks of the prize's universality, but does so in a very concrete sense. The Nobel Committee opens up the previous Eurocentric restrictions and seeks support in the words greatest benefit of mankind in Nobel's will. The award should now go to the writer whose work presents universal interest and appeals to a wider public. The third meaning of universal as accessibility now appears to be a dominant criterion. The effect is a certain extension of the prize in geographical terms in the 1930s, given 4 non-European laureates, but all of them American, and 3 of them with a strong popular appeal. Sinclair Lewis, 1930, John Galsworthy, 1932, and Pearl Buck, 1938. Even if pioneers of drama were acknowledged with the laureates Luigi Pirandello in 1934 and Eugene O'Neill in 1936, this policy had dire consequences. A genre with a quantitatively smaller audience like contemporary poetry is strikingly absent during the decade. The appeal to general accessibility motivated the exclusion of the widely acclaimed poet Paul Valéry from the prize in the year 1930. The third sense of universality as circulation suffers from a more fundamental fallacy that has recently been pointed out by Galin Tihanov. He writes, "The emphasis on circulation is the methodological expression of this value-neutral approach, which sees literature as generating profit and success rather than aesthetic value, the latter being an uncomfortably contestable entity." End quote. Circulation, if taken as a sufficient property of world literature, is simply incompatible with aesthetic judgment, which arguably should be the ultimate endeavor of the Nobel Committee. The problems in distilling a workable policy for the Nobel Prize out of Nobel's few and imprecise words did not end here. It should be noted, however, that after this rather long period of more or less unsuccessful exegetic attempts, the prize seemed better in tune with the developments in the literary world. A series of retrospectively non-disputed, felicitous Nobel Awards were given. One should mention writers like Hermann Hesse, T.S. Eliot, and William Faulkner. Why is this? The lesson for the Academy, I think, was that it stopped staring blindly at the words ideal direction in the donor's will and turned its eyes to the formula the most outstanding works. The literary criterion was no longer secondary to non-literary values. And this lesson has come to stay. This interest in pioneering works in contemporary writing also led the Nobel Committee step by step to a model of evaluation that deviated from world literature conceived as circulation. The pragmatic doctrine that I mentioned meant that the Academy should neither follow world opinion nor what is already universally recognized. Its task should, in accordance with Nobel's wish, be beneficial in the sense that it promotes literature in progress and does its best to discover unknown masters and literatures. The consequence was the well-known unpredictability of the Nobel Prize, representing a different view of world literature than the present state of letters can offer. It was probably less universal in the sense of accessibility than the previous approach, but more universal in including works that were not yet widely read and acknowledged. Thereby, it opened up a new category of interest, the potentially valuable. All the same, the Nobel Committee's effort to discover non-recognized works, writers, and forms of expression was not enough, since the Eurocentric and male-oriented policy still prevailed as late as in the 1980s. The awards to Rabindranath Tagore in 1914, to Gabriela Mistral in 1945 and to Yasunari Kawabata in 1968 were exceptions. And in 1981, the American review Baltimore Sun explicitly spoke of, quote, the European prize. The award having been awarded 73 out of 84 times to a European writer. The transition towards a broader perspective was one of the most acute challenges for the Swedish Academy and led to a change in the Nobel Committee's policy. Before I go into this, I would shortly comment on the Academy's relation to Goethe and his notion of world literature. Goethe's idea of universal classicism, commonly viewed as the first form of world literature, was no doubt decisive for the first generation in the Nobel Committee, but also for the conception of a more generous interpretation of the ideal in the subsequent committee of the 1920s. Many scholars hold on to Goethe's idea of world literature, and even today, as an expression of one indivisible humanity. Many believe that in our time of global connectedness, we should have the opportunity to really accomplish what Goethe called for, even if there are important differences between our view of world literature and Goethe's, of course. One such difference is that for Goethe, there is not yet a rift between economic and cultural exchange. His idea of world literature is embedded in an idea of cultural cosmopolitanism, much in the utopian spirit of the free market in Adam Smith, or in Immanuel Kant's universalist credo zum ewigen Frieden. We know that Goethe's idea of one humanity and a shared literary heritage is partially based on the new trends of book markets, translations, and transfer of ideas. Even if we cannot share his idyllic view of the market as overall beneficial, we can learn much from it. One thing is that Goethe's idea of world literature, as well as his notion of the classic, are plainly normative. It is also for us necessary to move from empirical fact to value judgment. We cannot equate circulation of books, which is a quantitative notion based on print runs and sales figures, with the best of books, which is a qualitative notion based on value judgment and critical examination. Even if a candidate for the prize to some extent needs to be translated and disseminated, their work does not have to be in broad circulation. And since our reading is always pointing to the future, to that which is not yet established or needs to be established, we have to assume a potential rather than an already existing world literature. Up to a point, Goethe himself appears to be aware of this. We may be surprised that Goethe in his conversations with Eckermann is quite frank when he says that he is no popular writer and never will be one. What he hopes for, though, is fortleben, to live on in his works, and thus to live on in posterity. He even stresses that everyone has a right to immortality. He looks into the future, to the potential of his craft. Of course, one can claim that William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, or Gabriel Garcia Marquez were world writers in the sense of circulation when they received the prize, whereas writers like Odysseus Elitis, Patrick Modiano, or Louise Glück had hardly entered this sphere of worldwide exchange when they received the prize. In effect, as a pragmatic doctrine was to prove, this very lack of translation and public recognition came to be an argument for the prize. But even if already established and canonized writers were also awarded, like Hemingway or Faulkner, it would still be an act that must find its own legitimacy. As Kant already had stressed, aesthetic judgment is fundamentally not grounded in past recognition and canons. The canonicity of a given work is therefore always at stake. Many writers who have received the prize have remained in the secret orbit where they once were discovered. The consecrating and canonizing force of the Nobel Prize is significant, but should, I believe, not be exaggerated. The process of nomination for Nobel is one further indication that world literature cannot be defined in terms of circulation. The nominations were in the first decade of the prize very few. The suggested writers no more than 25, and many of them hardly well known. The same is true today, when the Academy receives in general about 200 suggestions each year from qualified scholars all around the globe. On the other hand, several extraordinary writers like James Joyce, Joseph Conrad, or Virginia Woolf were not nominated at all. Why did the Swedish Academy and scholars and critics in the English-speaking countries fail to nominate them? In view of this, the present Swedish Academy has realized that the nomination process must be activated and supplemented by nominations from the Nobel Committee itself or from the other members of the Academy, and we must get much more suggestions from literary experts all over the globe. This supplementary nomination is very common today, but in the first half century of the prize, only a few nominees were suggested each year by the Academy. In 1901, 25 writers were nominated, some of them repeatedly, and the Academy contributed with a couple of nominations. In 2022, the external nominees were 127, and the supplementary ones 103. In historical perspective, it seems that the intense debate that preceded Samuel Beckett's award in 1969 initiated a more active Nobel Prize process. In that case, the Academy as a whole turned against the suggestion of the Nobel Committee and voted for Beckett. After that, the members of the committee have written individual reports, and not only the chair of the committee, as it was previously. And this allows for far greater liberty of judgment. It should be emphasized that it is the Academy as a whole and not the Nobel Committee that takes the final decision. I also think that the so-called pragmatic approach contributed to universalize the prize in different ways. It helped to consider neglected cultures and languages overlooked by the Eurocentric bias of the prize. Hitherto ignored female or non-white writers around the globe, untranslated or less known writers, and less popular genre like poetry, essays, or dramatic writings which have not reached a larger public. But even during this period, in the 1970s and 1980s, the criteria were never fixed and written down as a policy and never rigorously implemented by the Nobel Committee. The fact that internationally well-known and widely read writers like Marquez and William Golding received the prize during the pragmatic regime is proof enough. If we return to the new global ambition of the Nobel Committee, we should ask how well it has succeeded in taking into account the post-colonial literature that many critics have put attention to. It is quite evident that it took more than 7 decades until the global policy first was implemented in the middle of the 1980s. The first time that a writer representing a non-European language was awarded the prize was Yasunari Kawabata in 1968. When Tagore, as a great exception in the early Eurocentric phase, received the prize in 1913, he was typically nominated not by Indian scholars, but by the British Royal Society of Literature for the English version of Gitanjali. Versions in Bengali were not considered. In 1986, the Nigerian writer Wole Soyinka was awarded the prize, and soon after that, the Nobel Committee was reconstituted to fulfill the global intentions of the Academy. Compared to the first 80 years of the prize, the difference is remarkable. Naguib Mahfouz, Kenzaburi Oe, Derek Walcott, V.S. Naipaul, Gao Xingyang, J.M. Coetzee, Mo Yen, Abdulrazak Gurna are some of the non-European laureates since then. What should be emphasized is that national affiliation has weakened in the age of migration, and it is increasingly difficult to tie writers to one territorial origin. Many laureates in the past, like Nelly Sachs, Joseph Brodsky, Gao Xingyang, Herta Müller, Kazuo Ishiguro, or Gurna, are exile writers who cannot be regarded as representatives of one specific country. The historical change is perfectly in tune with the intentions of the donor, who was throughout anti-nationalist. But it also affects the state of world literature, I believe, and the meaning of universality. Another factor that also involves the second use of universality as representation is the attention to gender. And the shortcomings of the early Academy in this matter are just as grave as the above-mentioned reluctance to look beyond Europe. Of 117 prizes since 1901, 17 have been awarded to female writers, but 11 of them were awarded in recent decades, after 1991. Thus, the percentage has risen from 6.90 in the period 1901-1990 to 35.48 in the period 1991 to 2020. This may not be sufficient, but it shows a trend that in all probability will continue. The Nobel Committee and the Swedish Academy as a whole has a much stronger female representation than ever before, and this is a way to come to terms with previous male chauvinism and to ensure broader and deeper engagements with world literature. It is quite clear that all of these different demands, literary or non-literary, cannot be simultaneously satisfied. We should remember that justice is something else than literary excellence, and that excellent literature will probably never be evenly distributed around the globe. In fact, it is often at the moment when the literary criterion does not serve non-literary interests that a prize appears to have been most successful. But the bias has to be confronted. And this, I think, must happen in other ways than by restrictive rules. The question that many now ask is if literature is universal in the sense that it can be shared by everyone. In what ways do we have to reconsider Goethe's position? It is easy to agree with the African philosopher Achille Mbembe's view that the world as it is cannot be shared for racial and other reasons. However, Mbembe believes, just like Goethe, in one humanity, even if it is a humanity of violence and difference. He writes, "For in the end, there is only one world." This is a reasonable view, and particularly great achievements in science or the arts remind us of the unity of mankind. What is problematic is when the demands of just representation, that are always relevant when it comes to dealing with prejudice and bias are turned into a criterion of judgment. I believe that reading and the free judgment of taste must be the start and end point. And in this act, the Nobel Committee cannot rely on public opinion, given concepts of proofs of any kind, only on the reader's own experience and willingness to form a judgment with universal claims. This position, I guess, is roughly Kantian in spirit, where aesthetic judgment is based on disinterested, subjective experience, but at the same time raising claims of universality. Carefully, in the beginning of Kritik der Urteilskraft, Kant distinguishes between private inclinations, what we happen to like or prefer, and the experience of beauty where we are not driven by interest and where we have reached a sense of conviction that needs to be communicated. Kant says in that context that, quote, we believe we have a universal voice and lay claim to the agreement of others, end quote. Aesthetic judgment is in Kantian terms free and reflective, both subjective and universalizing, but we can never be sure that we have reached any absolute certainty in our judgment. This double structure is hardly unique for aesthetic judgment as a receptive aspect of literature. My belief is that the striving for universality is already part of literature itself, as indicated by Goethe's aspirations for Fortleben through his works in a coming life. William Franke has put it like this, quote, literature is already incipiently oriented to universal and potentially global significance. One could then go one step further and add a fifth sense of the universal. I mentioned 4 at the beginning of this lecture. And this fifth sense is perhaps the most important of them all. The idea that the Nobel Prize aims at the universal impact of literature, that is, its potential to reach anybody on this globe. This is roughly the same sense as the fourth one about universal recognition, but not quite. Here we are not dealing with empirical fact and already existing convictions. Looking at 2 recent laureates, one can see the difference between empirical and potential recognition. The late American poet Louise Glück was not well known or widely translated when she received the prize in 2020. But in the committee, we were convinced that this was going to be true someday. When the Norwegian playwright, romancier and poet Jon Fosse will receive the prize this year, it does not come as a surprise to anybody. He's already recognized almost everywhere just because of his universal impact. If universal impact means that everyone on this globe should ideally be able to take part of the Nobel laureate in literature, translatability is a necessary property of a work. And that is, of course, a problem in itself. In the Nobel Committee, we have always suffered from insufficient knowledge of languages, perhaps more than now than ever. Still, we should also remind ourselves that there always remains something untranslated in the transmission of literature. The Nobel Committee does not need to make philosophy of its practice, but since it also has its roots in the Goethe tradition, it can draw similar conclusions. It has always had a view of world literature, and it has always had to move between individual works and global context, ever conscious of its inevitable shortcomings. There has been a long journey from the Eurocentric idealism of the first generation around 1900 up to now. The first Nobel Committee was often reluctant to occupy this space in between cultures and languages. And it was so because of their strong affiliation with male, bourgeois culture and European aesthetics. But such bonds have loosened up considerably in recent decades. Nevertheless, and this will be my last point, our work in the Nobel Committee can never eliminate our own language and of mediation and the tradition in which it is steeped. It is part of our very ability to understand. Even if the Nobel Committee is required to free itself from all kinds of bias and cultural limitations, I think that Barbara Cassin's maxim seems wise, at least for the purposes of Nobel. She says, the universal is always universal for someone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders, for your very careful and scholarly deliberations on the different notions of universality that have guided the Nobel Prize Committee since the inception of the prize in 1901. It's a difficult act to follow. So in my very brief response, I want to continue our discussion in what sense and if the notion of a universal literature can indeed be a productive idea in the age of post-colonialism, gender politics, and the broader context of today's fractured world. Or, to put it differently and slightly polemically, should it be defended against the charge that it has propagated and sustained the predominantly white, male, and Eurocentric canon that you have outlined yourself, and that is manifestly evident in the Nobel Prize Awards until the 1990s, when they began to reflect a more diverse understanding of world literature. Just to mention a few more names, the first female recipients were Swedish author Selma Lagerlöf in 1909. The first non-European recipient was Tagore in 1914, that was already mentioned. The first non-European female writer was Chilean Gabriela Mistral in 1945, who you also mentioned. The first black recipient was Nigerian Wallace Yonka in 1984, and Toni Morrison was the first black woman to receive the prize in 1993. So in the following, I want to touch on three versions of universal literature which simultaneously support and perhaps complicate the idea, and I will of course also refer to Goethe's paradigm of Weltliteratur. My second example is Edward Said's notion of worldliness, and my third one, Amy Apter's more recent rejection of the idea of world literature. So let me go back to Goethe, and some of the things that I will say will overlap with what you've just heard. In the aftermath of World War II, the Germanist Fritz Strich published his seminal book on Goethe and world literature, which appeared in English already in 1949. Against the backdrop of the total defeat and moral ruination of Germany as a Kulturnation, Strich, like many of his contemporaries, turned to Goethe's enlightened cosmopolitanism to recover the idea of shared ethical values based on a universal classical aesthetic. Since then, references to Goethe's Weltliteratur have become the staple in comparative literature debates and more recently in world literature departments. For example, David Damrosch, the distinguished comparatist and proponent of world literature as a discipline, opens his edited volume on world literature in theory and practice, published in 2014, with the following Goethe quotation: "The age of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach." This famous quotation has been passed down to us by Eckermann, Goethe's young secretary and eager disciple, who reports that the issue came up in a conversation with Goethe in January 1827. At that point, the 77-year-old writer had witnessed the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon's defeat, restoration under Metternich, the passing of the repressive Karlsbad decrees, and the enforcement of rigid censorship, all in the service of the preservation of the Habsburg Empire. So, this is the historical context in which Goethe formulated the notion of world literature. It targets the narrow-minded parochialism of the Metternich era as well as rising German nationalism, which Goethe despised. But what precisely does the term mean? As Strich notes, Goethe's scattered deliberations on the subject, and one should mention that he never wrote an essay on it, offered a layered explication that is far removed from the simple idea of a literature transcending geographical and temporal boundaries. We can glean what he meant from his journal Kunst und Altertum, where Goethe reported extensively on foreign literatures while also informing his readership of the reception of German writing, his own included, in France, England, and Italy, and elsewhere. For Goethe, travel and translation played a central role in the creation of world literature as a practice. Writing in 1800 to Bitobe, the French translator of Hermann and Dorothea, he wrote, "If I were younger, I would plan to visit you, to learn more of the manners and customs in France, the characteristics of its inhabitants and their moral and spiritual needs after this great crisis." And of course, he's referring to the French Revolution here. So if readers want to understand a foreign literature, according to Goethe, they must acquaint themselves with the historical context of the work, the geography, climate, and the mode of life of its people. In fact, they must delve into the whole environment in which the writer lived and produced their work. Or, as Goethe put it, I quote, "To understand the writer, you must be at home in his country." This means that world literature is for Goethe grounded in what ethnographers today would call a thick reading practice that engages with historical places and times. Precisely because it is anchored in the particular, literature has the capacity to transcend parochial and national boundaries by articulating, translating, and maintaining otherness and difference. And so it is only fitting that Goethe practiced this encounter with otherness in his West Eastern Divan. Inspired by his reading of the Persian poet Hafiz in 1814, the West Eastern Divan is a conversation between the poetry and history of his native Germany and that of Persia. It explores and celebrates both otherness and commonality through poetic voice and form. And now I'm going to talk about Edward Said. Said's contribution to the debate on world literature spans his entire career, from his early translation of the important Auerbach essay Philology and World Literature, published in 1969, his major books from Orientalism, Culture Imperialism, to the essays collected in The World, the Text and the Critic, published in 1989. A key term in Said's critical vocabulary is the idea of worldliness, which he pitches against all forms of identitarian thinking, and this is why he is so relevant today. Worldliness is for Said a way of reading and writing, a critical practice which overcomes the kinds of separations that he critiqued first in Orientalism. According to Said, Orientalism is not a mere political subject or field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions, but rather, I quote, a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philological texts. Said then returns to our Bachian idea of world literature as philology, that is, as a slow and careful practice of writing, reading, and disseminating that pays attention to complex connections, transformations, translations, and modes of exchange between texts and contexts across boundaries. In Culture and Imperialism, he took umbrage with the discipline of comparative literature, which had uncritically scaffolded its entire methodology around Goethe's world literature. I quote, The genuinely profound scholarship of the people who believed in and practiced comparative literature implied the extraordinary privilege of an observer located in the West who could actually survey the world's literary output with sovereign detachment, end of quote. Obviously, this is a problem that still haunts the Nobel Prize Committee to this day, and maybe we can discuss this later. Said then tracks the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory in the works of Jane Austen, Joseph Conrad, and Rudyard Kipling. He recognized the pleasure he personally derived from reading their works and explains that the challenge is to connect them not only with that pleasure and profit, but also with the imperial process of which they were manifestly and unconcealedly a part. Stepping outside the imperial tradition, Said foregrounds non-metropolitan, marginal writers who, by writing back from the periphery, challenged the privileged position of the West. From an Irish perspective, his reading of William Butler Yeats is particularly interesting in this regard. Instead of placing Yeats in the tradition of European modernism or in the context of Irish national literature, he reads him as a transnational poet of decolonization by putting him in dialogue with Pablo Neruda from Chile, Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Mahmoud Darwish from Palestine. That is, with writers who all responded to experiences of imperial violence, political oppression, and displacement. So Said's worldliness rejects a comforting reception of Goethe's world literature. Instead of a universal world literature that somehow harmoniously transcends boundaries, there is the worldliness of exile, I quote. Exile, far from being the fate of nearly forgotten unfortunates who are dispossessed and expatriated, becomes something closer to a norm, an experience of crossing boundaries and charting new territories, however much its loss and sadness should be acknowledged, end of quote. So if exile is the new universal of world literature in our fractured world, then this must surely be reflected in how we read, what we value, and also what and how we translate works of literature. And this brings me to my final intervention, Amy Apter's rejection of the idea. Apter's Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, published in 2013, makes a very complex argument about what is wrong with what she calls an entrepreneurial, bulimic world literature paradigm and the field of translation studies. This is not the place to offer a detailed summary of her erudite defense of untranslatability. Suffice it to say that according to Apter, both world literature and translation studies have largely been blind to the recurrent realities of translation failure and the challenges of untranslatability. To make things worse, as an academic discipline, world literature allowed itself to be appropriated by, I quote, universities seeking to justify the downsizing of national literature departments or the cutting of foreign language instruction, end of quote. And this certainly rings true in the United Kingdom, the USA, and indeed in Ireland. Echoing Spivak and others, Apter argues that world literature's ethic of liberal inclusiveness often has the collateral effect of blunting political critique. So, as an antidote to this humanities light approach, she advocates the untranslatable as a category that screws up the notion of world literature in productive ways. Tolstoy's famous opening of War and Peace is a case in point. Tolstoy sought admission to the arena of world literature by using French extensively in the opening dialogues and for another 5 chapters or more. And French and German occur frequently in the rest of the book. As Apter comments, Tolstoy trademarked the world novel as a chronicle of political instability and crisis by leaning heavily on untranslatability, whether in the guise of non-translated passages in French and German, Russian-inflected French, or totally unreliable translations in the notes, which he wrote himself. And so it is that the heteroglossic society of war and peace becomes an expression of subterranean revolutionary urges. Apter uses this as an example of what she calls in German verkehrte Weltliteratur, a screwed-up world literature, a term she borrows from Marx and Engels to encourage the literature of this world to mess with world literature. So where does this leave the idea of literary universality? Perhaps we can tentatively suggest that in the era of a homogenizing globalization, universality can only ever be envisioned as a situated idea that must be highly self-reflexive and fractured. So perhaps for me, it is no longer Kantian, or the Kantian ideal is perhaps no longer tenable. The idea of a situated universality would build on Goethe's notion of Weltliteratur, understood as an arena where commonality and differences are articulated through a particular universality and a universal particularity in aesthetic form. Such a situated universality would also query the idea of one world literature, all with capital letters, and the quick endorsement of cultural equivalences. It would embrace the worldliness of the exile in Said's sense, as well as Apter's untranslatability as a critical practice in defiance of the commodification of world literature. Thank you.
So now's the time for the questions and answers. So if I could ask you please to raise your hand if you have a question, and please wait, there are microphones, and as an extra added bonus, you could also give your name and affiliation perhaps when you do get the microphone. So again, this discourse is open for questions, and definitely there will be some answers. Yes, over on our left. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Olsson and Anne. You asked me to give my affiliation. I feel a little bit unsure of myself doing that, because this would be the first time that I've identified myself for the project that I am a part of. I am a podcaster, and I'm much more comfortable sitting in a dark room behind a microphone. So my podcast is called Poems for the Speed of Life. And my question for both of you, I think, it's a little bit less academic and more practical in this world we're living in, the society we're living in, unduly stressed, hyper-connected, high levels of indebtedness across the board, across the world. My thesis is that literature and poetry in particular has practical benefits, almost like practical self-help and a form of therapeutic. So I'm just wondering, have you any ideas on that? It's obviously we're in the academy, but this is maybe a less academic question. Thank you.
I think that the words from Alfred Nobel, the donor, for the benefit of mankind, he touches upon this issue, what is beneficial actually, with the arts and literature, and how do we interpret these words actually today. And I think that you have to answer that in a rather personal way. And for me, I cannot live without literature and the arts. It's like Baudelaire once said that he cannot live one day without. It's like bread, you know. He has to have something to read. And I think that there is a very concrete dimension of this also in our work with the Nobel Prize. It is always something subjective in your engagements. And I think that reading, and that's something that I would like to say that also in response to what you said, and I think that we could perhaps agree on that you have to rely on reading all the time. When you make a judgment, you cannot rely on a position, on a scholarly position, or like a school that you adhere to. Those premises are not relevant when you come to literature concretely, you know, a specific work. That would be my response.
What do I need to do to turn this on?
Did you hear me with my microphone? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I would like to echo this. Of course, reading is always intimate and personal, subjective. That is a point of departure. I think it doesn't have to stay there. I think you can expand out. But if you don't have a personal encounter with a text or a poem or whatever it may be, it's not going to reach you. So there must be a response in the reader. That is the first encounter. And so, of course, your podcasts will have probably, a broad listenership because what you do resonates with them. I'm very much in favor of podcasting poetry. I think it reaches a young readership especially because it goes beyond the page of the book. But it also brings young readers to poetry, which often has the aura of being difficult when it isn't. Because the first experience of reading a poem is a kind of a sensation. Yeah. So it's effective, and of course then you can engage on a deeper level with it. You don't have to. You can. It's an invitation. It opens a door. So yeah, good work. Great. I'm glad you're here.
Any further questions? Yes, in the middle. So we've two hands, almost equal. So we'll start with the one on the right, and then we'll go down to the back, if that's all right.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anders. This was extremely interesting. I'm Bianca Cataldi from the UCD Humanities Institute, so University College Dublin. I just have a question. I want to go back to the issue of circulation. So we were talking about how certain of these authors are not well known at the moment when they receive the prize, and sometimes they're still unknown after they've received the prize, like in a wider sense. And I was wondering about that, because usually publishers, what they do is to jump on the winning, on the winning horse, so they're just trying to translate as much as possible when an author wins the prize. So what are your thoughts about it? Like, why certain authors receive the prize, so they're clearly deserving, but then they don't get picked up by a wider audience, even if they get translated? So I was wondering about this, like, in your experience, why does this happen, you think? Thank you. I don't know if it's a clear question, but I was just wondering about that.
I don't think I have an answer to that, because it is so different. I mean, some writers, you have no idea what will happen after the prize, and I think there is always some kind of uncertainty which is there, and I would say that what you need when you decide the winner of the Nobel Prize is some kind of divination. And that's a word of Schleiermacher, for instance, the Romantic. But the important thing with that notion is that it is kind of guesswork involved, because what has been in the past doesn't play any role, actually, and it shouldn't play any role. I think the example that I gave with Louise Glück, is or I could also mention Herta Müller. Louise Glück was hardly known in Europe when she received the prize, whereas Herta Müller was not at all known in United States. And suddenly they started to read Herta Müller, and they started to translate Glück all over Europe, I would say. And this is fantastic, of course, and that is, I think, proves also the normative force of the Nobel Prize and our need of examples. And I think that the Nobel Prize is an impossible assignment. Actually, I mean, it is impossible for reasons that you gave in your response. I mean, but still it is necessary, because we need really to focus on excellent literature, because it guides us in our reading. And that would be also I cannot answer your question so specific, but I think that this has to do with this the situation that we are in, and that we can discuss literature on high level globally, and this dialogue over the borders is so important for us all.
Can I ask a question in response to your deliberations? I mean, you mentioned in passing the vexed idea of the autonomous artwork, and we could spend hours just discussing the question to what extent art is or should be considered to be autonomous. Adorno thought so, very much so. Benjamin didn't share that particular point because he was a historical materialist, etc. And for the Academy, of course, this is a very tricky issue which surfaced when Peter Handke was awarded the Nobel Prize in, when was it? Can't remember, 2019, I think. And just for the audience, Peter Handke, the Austrian writer, who I think actually for me, I would say his early work is particularly compelling. But he had denied the genocide in the Serbian war. So he went to Milosevic's funeral and spoke there, and he even compared the fate of the Serbs in that war to the Jews during the Holocaust. So later he apologized for that, and it said it was just a slip of his tongue. And when interviewed about this issue after receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature, he said, not one word I've written about Yugoslavia can be denounced, not a single one, it is literature. So he used the idea of the autonomous artwork as an escape route to actually defend his indefensible position, political position, and to say, well, what I do is literature. It has nothing to do with the political reality, even though he made a very significant intervention, political intervention at a particular point. And I personally felt at the time that it was a catastrophic decision by the Nobel Prize Committee to award the Nobel Prize of Literature to Handke, and to defend it by saying that after all, you know, the Nobel Prize exceeds the murky grounds of politics, and it is about the autonomous artwork. Would you like to respond to that challenge?
Yes, why not? I think it was a very, very fine decision, and I agree with you that Handke is absolutely not a good politician, and what he says about politics is sometimes absolutely untenable, you know. But almost everything that he has written does not provoke me as a reader. He has a huge work of literature, and what you are referring to, are some minor works, probably the worst that he has written, that on the whole does not seem relevant when we try to decide his work. I mean, he has written perhaps 130 works, you know, and if you look at that, these essays on Serbia and Yugoslavia, of course, they are provoking. I agree on that. Yeah. But how should we really treat a writer like that, who has meant so much also for the whole generation, the generation from 1980, 90s, you know, for perhaps the first 30 years. What was decisive for us in the Nobel Committee was that Hanke still was a great writer when he received the prize. He had written this magnificent epic, the Obst Dibin, just the summer it came out, just before we made the decision. And so I would defend him, really. I think it was wonderful.
Okay.
Deliberations of the committee themselves, I'm sure, would be very interesting. And thank you for illuminating us on that. Again, we're down to the lady in the far left, if that's all right. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yes, now it is.
Thanks very much, Professor Olsson. It was very interesting. I hope you won't think this question is flippant. It's just you talked about the evolution of the number of nominations and the developing global nature of the prize as a result of more nominations. And I wonder what you think the right number would be. What would be the ideal number of nominations to have a truly global view, and how on earth would you process that number?
I don't think that one could measure that in numbers. I think it has to do with the quality of nominations. And it is a huge problem. But I think it is extremely important now what we see also in the scholarly world, how many people, among scholars at the universities, are now starting to also examine what has happened with the Nobel Prize. It was in Germany, for instance, coming out dissertations and about the first 70 years now of the prize, and more systematically, you know, also trying to come to terms with the premises of the prize. There was so, as far as nominations are concerned, I think we have suffered from. I mean, it was not acceptable that, for instance, Joyce, Conrad, and Woolf never were nominated during their lifetime. It is extremely provocative for me to know this, but that does not have anything to do with numbers. It has to do with your aesthetic sensibility and courage. How do you detect the real talents in your own time? And we are so blind what's happening right now. I mean, and perhaps in 20 or 30 years, we realize how wrong we were, or how could we not, you know, discover that and that writer. So I think this goes deep, this problem, really.
I think you touched on it in your in your discourse, in terms of what we receive as world literature is a very limited selection, pre-selected by translation. So if we speak 3 languages, 4, some 5, whatever, it still is a very small number of languages, given the idea of a disparate world literature. And I think it's very difficult for minor languages, to use that term, to reach that global audience and to make it onto a shortlist for this big prize. So how do you address this practically in your committee? Could you give us some insight? I mean, I'm sure that you have perhaps 20, maybe 30 languages represented, or competencies represented on your committee. How do you deal with the fact that often you need to read a writer in translation?
I think that something that we have done in recent years, since the year when I started as a chair of the committee, we had introduced 10 or 11 experts in language areas that we did not have enough competence in these literatures. And I think and that we have that now, and we get reports from these experts, and that is in African languages, Indian languages, East Asian and Latin American languages, Slavic languages too. And I think then we get suggestions from these experts every year, and perhaps 50, 60 suggestions, and take part of them. And some of these suggestions, perhaps 30, 40 of them, are nominated by us in the Academy. So that's something new and a necessary step, to get a deeper understanding of what's happening in the world outside Europe and outside our own linguistic sphere. So we are working on it, really. And of course we have perhaps 8, 9 language ourselves that we are in command of, but we are really depending, of course, on translations. Yeah. And the major languages, most disseminated, right, that is so important for us to, in French, of course, German, Spanish, Russian, and so forth.
Great. I might use the opportunity of being close to a microphone myself to ask a question, if that's all right. Robert Zimmerman, better known as Bob Dylan, poet, musician, troubadour, seemingly on a never-ending tour himself, was perhaps a surprise awardee of the Nobel Prize in Literature. I can't ask you to maybe discuss or describe that decision, but my question is more, what was the feedback to the Nobel Committee after that award? So both positive and negative. What was it like?
Well, it was of course enormous feedback in different ways. It was provoking so many, positively or negatively, I think that the prize to Bob Dylan was insofar productive that it started a discussion: what is actually literature, and what is how do we distinguish between written and oral, and the song, and that this kind of literature that he represents, we haven't put that, so to speak, on our board yet, but we did it then, and there are so many great singers that also have produced fine texts, of literary value. I think that was a very good discussion, and it is a discussion that continues. And that is just one example of how, let's say, the perspective has changed and been also expanded in the recent years. Also, for instance, when Alexievich was awarded the prize, I think that was perhaps more important from a literary point of view, because her way of writing has really stretched also the limits of what is literature, and how do we actually conceive of this kind of advanced forms of journalism, and that's very, very important. And the third example of this expansion, so to speak, of the concept of literature, that would be witness literature. Which we also try to focus on in the case of Kertész, for instance, Imre Kertész, the beginning of the 20th century. Extremely important genre in contemporary writing.
Yeah, I think there was a question at the back.
So perhaps if this could be the second last question, and we'll leave it at that, if that's okay, please. So the next microphone is needed up front on the right.
Can I?
Yes?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. I'm Claudia de la Casa from UCD as well. I wanted to ask something that Anne has already touched upon. My interest is in how how does the academy works? Because I didn't know, for instance, that all those languages were represented, and I was wondering, how do you get to be part of that, and how diverse the academy is? Because we can question how diverse the prizes, the authors that are that receive the prizes can be. But of course, I think it's very important for the circle of people who decide to be diverse. And so, of course, languages need to be represented, but also, I guess, political views and personal backgrounds. So, yeah, if you can, because you also said that the moment you started having more women in the committee, you started expanding in terms of gender. So it would be interesting to see also, maybe if you expand in terms of color, ethnic background, religions. So maybe you already are diversified in that sense. I just don't know. So I was curious to know how that works. Thank you.
Well, it's an adventure every step. How I think that is so. The fascinating thing about literature is, of course, that it gives you the ability to confront other worlds that are quite different from your own world, so to speak. And that is the fascinating thing about literature, that perhaps more than sciences, I mean, that this leap of imagination makes it possible to take part of worlds that are not your own. And it is something that you have to work on all the time. As I said previously, this is of course an impossible prize in many ways, but it is also a fantastic assignment. And we cannot resign and say no to Nobel, because we need this kind of openness for other cultures, other languages, other literatures, in order to get on with our own lives. It's so enriching, I would say. And gender, other cultures, other languages, we have to get out of ourselves. Yeah. Scandinavia, Europe, this male chauvinism, which was that were the premises in the beginning of the prize. But now we are doing something else, altogether different.
Yep.
Again, the final question here, just down on our right.
Good evening. I don't have an academic affiliation. I'm a scientific linguist employed commercially. I was wondering, my name is Daria Ostrowski. I have, my native language is Polish. I was wondering, the word universal holds some sort of a promise of conferring a universal good. But from what I understood from the lectures, this universal good can only be conferred really in a genuine way, locally, in a very fragmented way because of geopolitical situations and differences in cultures and languages. Wouldn't you say that then that this actually devoids the world universal of meaning in the sphere of debating literatures and debating what works of literature should be considered for universal recognition in the context of the Nobel Prize?
I think that you can be surprised of what can reach a reader on the other side of the globe. Your literature, you have to believe that literature has the power to reach anyone on this globe. I'm very optimistic and perhaps utopian in this belief, but I have, for instance, poetry is a small genre in a sense, but it has, when it is really good and excellent, the power to reach any reader. I think. The problem is translation, and what we discussed here. And you talked about untranslatability. And I think that I have also read Apter's book, which is very provocative in many ways. But I don't think I need the concept world literature, but I believe in the impact of literature to reach any reader, any possible reader on the globe. And if you don't have that, I don't think you can write. Yeah. I don't think that you can be productive as a writer if you don't believe in the possibility of the word to travel, And this potential impact of literature is so fundamental, I think, to man as such, That's also.
Maybe as my concluding remark, I would say that, of course, as a reader, I believe in the universal impact or the potential of literature to have a universal impact. Universal meaning that it is completely unpredictable how a particular work of literature will impact any reader. And this unpredictability makes it open, and obviously the imagination is the pathway for that act of communication. But I still think that the Nobel Prize, that's not the fault of the Nobel Prize Committee, is now part of a kind of a global marketization of world literature. And this I wanted to criticize, because it is bulimic. I really like that term by Apter. It's an entrepreneurial bulimic notion that everything has to be world literature, and that I oppose. But of course, we have to. I know you do, but we have to hang on to the utopian belief that literature can reach potentially anyone, anywhere, at any time, but not always. Yeah, this is a happy act of communication when that happens between a text and a reader. But as readers, we look out for these happy coincidences, and we don't have to agree about everything. I leave it at that.
That's a very nice point to finish. Sincere thank you to Professor Olsson and Professor Fuchs. I'm sure you'll agree it was the most enjoyable and interesting Academy discourse. Thank you for the audience this evening for your participation, some very interesting and provocative questions, and thank you to Anna and Anders for the thoughtful manner in which you've dealt with all of those questions. Some of them tricky, I would say, even for a mere chemist. Can I just say I'd like to thank the Secretary of the Academy, Mary O'Dowd, who unfortunately is not well enough to be with us this evening, for organising the Academy Discourse programme. The next Academy Discourse, Light Illuminates Innovation in Medicine and Climate Solutions, will be on Thursday, the 16th of November at 6 p.m. with Professor Naomi Hallis, Director of the Smalley Curl Institute at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Same venue, 16th of November, 6 p.m. Details of the event you can find on the Academy website, www.ria.ie, and I hope that you will be able to join us then. Thank you all for attending today's discourse, and do please join us now for refreshments in the front rooms. Thank you very much.